I'm Rachel Maddow, and tonight we need to talk about something very serious. Trump, prison imminent after judge denies appeal. Okay, so we need to talk about what actually happened with Trump's hush money sentencing back in January, because there has been so much confusion and misinformation about this case and what it means that the president of the United States is now officially a convicted felon serving his term while that conviction stands on his record. The Supreme Court rejected Trump's emergency request to block the sentencing on January 9th, with Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett joining the 3 liberal justices over the dissent of 4 conservative justices, and that cleared the way for Judge Juan Merchan to proceed with sentencing on January 10th, just days before Trump's inauguration. The sentence that Merchan imposed was unconditional discharge, which means no prison time and no fines and no probation. But the conviction itself stands. And Trump is now officially the first president in American history to hold office while convicted of felony crimes. This is genuinely unprecedented. We have never had anything like this before. And the implications for the rule of law and for how we think about accountability and justice are profound, regardless of what you think about Trump or his policies. The specific crimes that Trump was convicted of, 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, stemmed from payments made to adult film actress Stormy Daniels during the 2016 campaign to keep her quiet about an alleged affair. The prosecution argued that Trump directed the scheme to pay Daniels and then covered up the true nature of the payment by recording it as legal expenses in his business records, which constituted falsification under New York law. A jury of 12 ordinary citizens heard the evidence and deliberated and returned a guilty verdict on all 34 counts back in May of 2024, making Trump the first former president ever to be convicted of felony crimes. He then ran for president anyway, won the election, and took office as a convicted felon whose sentencing had been delayed multiple times because of appeals and legal maneuvering designed to push it past the inauguration. The Supreme Court's decision to deny the emergency stay was significant because it showed that at least some conservative justices, including Roberts and Barrett, were not willing to intervene to protect Trump from the consequences of his conviction. The 4 dissenting justices, Thomas and Alito and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, argued that the sentencing should be blocked given the unique circumstances of a president-elect facing criminal punishment days before taking office. But the majority held that the case should proceed through normal channels and that Trump's arguments for why the conviction should be overturned could be addressed through the appeals process rather than through emergency intervention by the Supreme Court. This was a rebuke to Trump's legal strategy, which had relied heavily on getting the courts to short-circuit normal procedures and grant him special treatment. And it forced him to face sentencing before he took the oath of office. Judge Merchan's decision to impose unconditional discharge rather than actual punishment reflected the unique circumstances he was dealing with. A convicted felon who was about to become president and who could not realistically be sent to prison or placed on probation while holding that office. The judge acknowledged that the crimes Trump committed were serious and that under normal circumstances, a defendant convicted of 34 felonies would face real consequences. But he also recognized that imposing jail time or fines or supervision on a sitting president would create constitutional complications that the courts were not prepared to address. The unconditional discharge allowed the conviction to stand, cementing Trump's status as a felon while avoiding the practical impossibility of actually punishing someone who was about to assume the powers of the presidency. Trump's response to the sentencing was characteristically defiant. He called it a witch hunt and vowed to continue appealing forever. But the reality is that he is now a convicted felon, regardless of what happens in the appeals process. The conviction is on his record. The jury's verdict stands. And the historical fact that the 47th president of the United States was convicted of 34 felonies cannot be erased, no matter how many appeals are filed or how many times Trump claims he was treated unfairly. This is the legacy he will carry, not just as a president, but as the first felon to hold the office. And it raises profound questions about whether the rule of law means anything when someone powerful enough can avoid real consequences even after being found guilty by a jury of their peers. All right, let us really dig into the details of how we got here and what the legal dynamics of the case tell us about the state of American justice and the challenges of holding powerful people accountable. The hush money case was always the least serious of the criminal matters Trump faced. The charges in the classified documents case and the January 6th cases involved much more significant alleged misconduct. But it was also the case that moved most quickly through the system and that resulted in an actual trial and conviction before the 2024 election. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office brought the case and prosecuted it efficiently, presenting evidence over several weeks of trial that convinced all 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt that Trump had committed the charged offenses. The conviction was not the result of some rushed or unfair process. It was the product of the American criminal justice system operating exactly as it is supposed to when someone is accused of breaking the law. The evidence presented at trial included testimony from key witnesses, including Michael Cohen, Trump's former attorney, who was directly involved in arranging and concealing the payment to Stormy Daniels. Cohen testified that Trump personally directed the scheme and was aware that the payments were being disguised as legal expenses to hide their true purpose. The defense argued that Cohen was not credible and that the documentary evidence did not prove Trump's direct involvement. But the jury found otherwise after reviewing all of the evidence and hearing arguments from both sides. This is how criminal trials work. Witnesses testify and evidence is presented and lawyers make arguments and jurors decide what they believe. And in this case, the jurors unanimously concluded that Trump was guilty on all counts. The delay between the May verdict and the January sentencing reflected Trump's legal strategy of using every available procedural tool to postpone consequences and complicate the legal proceedings. His lawyers filed motions challenging the verdict on various grounds, arguing that evidence was improperly admitted and that the prosecution theory was flawed and that presidential immunity should protect Trump from conviction for actions related to his campaign. Judge Merchan rejected these arguments and scheduled sentencing, but the appeals and emergency motions continued all the way up to the Supreme Court. The goal was clearly to push the sentencing past the inauguration, when Trump could potentially use the powers of the presidency to further complicate or derail the case. But the Supreme Court's refusal to grant a stay defeated that strategy and forced Trump to face sentencing before taking office. The Supreme Court vote that allowed the sentencing to proceed was 5-4, with Roberts and Barrett joining the 3 liberal justices against the 4 most conservative members of the court. This split is notable because it shows that at least some conservative justices were not willing to extend special protection to Trump, despite his political importance to the conservative movement. Roberts and Barrett apparently concluded that the normal legal process should be allowed to proceed, that Trump's arguments for overturning the conviction could be addressed through appeals rather than through emergency intervention, and that blocking the sentencing would be inappropriate given the lack of any showing that proceeding would cause irreparable harm. The dissenting justices, Thomas and Alito and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, argued that the unique circumstances warranted blocking the sentencing, but they did not have the votes to prevail. The unconditional discharge that Merchan imposed is a sentencing option that exists under New York law for cases where conviction itself is seen as sufficient sanction and where additional punishment would be inappropriate given the circumstances. It is relatively rare, typically used in cases involving minor offenses or defendants with sympathetic circumstances, and using it for a defendant convicted of 34 felonies is highly unusual. But Merchan apparently concluded that the unique situation of sentencing a president-elect made unconditional discharge the most appropriate option, allowing the conviction to stand and be recorded while avoiding the constitutional complications that would arise from actually punishing someone about to assume the presidency. Critics have argued that this amounts to two-tiered justice, that any ordinary defendant convicted of the same crimes would face real consequences, and that the discharge effectively rewards Trump for winning an election while under criminal prosecution. The appeals that Trump has promised to pursue will take months or years to work through the system, and there is no guarantee that he will ultimately prevail, even if he succeeds in delaying final resolution indefinitely. The arguments he has raised about immunity and evidentiary rulings and prosecutorial conduct have all been considered and rejected by the trial court and will be reviewed by appellate courts that apply deferential standards to trial court decisions. Most legal experts believe the conviction will ultimately be upheld. The evidence was strong and the trial was conducted properly. But the appeals process will drag on throughout Trump's presidency and provide ongoing ammunition for claims of persecution and unfair treatment. Whether those claims resonate with voters or whether they grow tired of hearing about legal matters they have already discounted will affect the political implications of the ongoing case. The historical significance of having a convicted felon serve as president cannot be overstated because it represents a fundamental departure from the assumptions that have governed American politics since the founding. The framers assumed that the electoral process would filter out candidates with obvious disqualifying characteristics, that voters would not elect someone who had been found guilty of serious crimes, and they did not include explicit provisions barring convicted felons from holding the presidency because they thought such provisions were unnecessary. Trump's election and service as a convicted felon tests that assumption, demonstrating that a sufficiently motivated base can overlook criminal convictions that would have been disqualifying for any previous candidate. And it raises questions about whether the constitutional system can function as designed when voters are willing to ignore the rule of law in choosing their leaders. The connection to the other criminal cases Trump faced helps put the hush money conviction in context and explains why it proceeded to conviction while the others did not. The classified documents case in Florida was dismissed by Judge Cannon on grounds that have been widely criticized as legally dubious, and that dismissal is being appealed but will not result in any trial during Trump's current term. The January 6th cases brought by Jack Smith were effectively ended when Trump won the election, since a president cannot be prosecuted while in office, and the special counsel resigned after issuing reports that documented the evidence against Trump without resulting in any conviction. Only the New York case moved quickly enough to produce a verdict before the election, and only that conviction will mark Trump's record as president. The political implications of being a convicted felon while serving as president are